An Introduction to the Continent of Astilion by Archivist Carmen Wilder of the Koman Academy. Publication date 19th of January, 3019, KC. Salutations and congratulations, dear reader, for with your purchase of this volume you have gained the premier and foremost authority on that youngest continent, Astilion. I, Carmen Wilder, first Archivist of the Koman Academy, shall be your humble shepherd on your journey into the edges of the known. In this tome I shall impart unto you the most definitive accounting of the history recorded thus far of this most wondrous land, along with a deep, reverent understanding of the land itself. Though, know this, dearest reader, no accounting, however well written or entertaining or eye-opening, is a suitable substitute for the true land itself. And while some of my contemporaries may attempt to poke holes in my account of Astilion, fueled by their envy of my superior articulation and station at the Academy, it is, unfortunately, the case that I may err in my account of the history, though I should say that it comes with the territory, as my predecessors and they of long lives are given to opine, interject, or embellish to the detriment of factual record. So, instead of simply reading this book and marveling at it through the medium of the written word, I would implore all who carry the torch of adventure to bring themselves to Astilion, to uncover the truth firsthand that it may be passed down to posterity, and to witness the beauties that Astilion holds. The island of Astilion is quite a marvel, particularly with respect to its geography. It is a rather large continent encompassing beyond 87,000 nautical leagues, near to 3 million square miles, of landmass, and a diverse range of biomes with an equally diverse and stunning composition of flora and fauna in its ecosystems. Many of the wilds in the continent remain untamed, having been free of intervention and meddling from the civilized world for millennia. And this arrangement has borne fruit in the often sheer hostility in this wilderness. Upon first arrival to this land, the elven settlers of the Koman Empire faced steep challenges, and accounts of the time are often dire, though they didn't seem to let that dampen their natural drive to bring order to chaos as they have. And though this wilderness generally lacks the graces and refinements of a more polite and noble society, its unrivaled beauty does aught to compensate. The south is split between the tranquil rolling grasslands of the autumn plains, whose sunsets are able to inspire a quietness of mind and a stillness of soul in even the most belligerent and brooding of men, and the lush, vibrant, and lively forests of the eastern woodlands, where the symphonies of the fauna would lead one to believe they'd stumbled into a cheery and fantastical kingdom of the arboreal critters there. Dotting the landscape of the southeast are mountains and foothills, where the forest's vivacious harmonies give way to serene vistas and a feeling of contemplative stillness as the trees fade and one rises above the canopy line. While the south could be, in a great disservice to its beauty, described as glorious, the north is better described as majestic. Here the cold, dry air begets a stillness that lends a sort of dignified way to nearly everything north of the Heartland Mountains. Here, even small, dull, and monotonous actions become an opportunity to connect with one's soul. The birds chirp a little more soulfully, the rabbits scamper a little more daintily, the deer bound a little more elegantly. Here it is a land where one can truly breathe and be unburdened of the follies and trials and tribulations of high society and academia, where one can make fated decisions and be left with not a second thought afterward. Much of this majesty is, however, tempered by ferocity. Just as the rose rends the hand that hopes to seize it, so too do the valleys of the north enact retribution on the unprepared. In the winters this land becomes one of hardship, turmoil, and even death. In this place, in these winters, the snow buffets anything that dares stand in its path. It covers the ground as though it were a blanket, hoping to tuck the north into its yearly rest, with its unforgiving blizzards seeking to smother all those who would disturb its sleeping babe. The settlers of then, as the elves of now, report snowfalls as massive as 20 feet. Particularly bad winters are known to kill off much of the game, leading to food shortages that forestalled exploration by settlers in antiquity, and that threatened the disparate settlements of the area in already the most vulnerable and fraught with hardship season of the year. Such is the balance of this land. There is not give without take. There are not satisfactions without hardships. There is not joy without sorrow. Such is the truest majesty of this land, that it manifests in both its joy and its rage. This is not a land for the weak of will or the unappreciative of its lessons and its beauty in all forms. Astilion's Unbidden Guardian, Pre-Landing, before 2164. When I dubbed Astilion the youngest continent, I feel I may have confused some, so allow me to clarify. Astilion is no younger than anywhere else, or at least not younger than the greater Oldenhir to its south. Instead, Astilion is named the youngest due to its isolation from the rest of the world until quite recently. Well, recently in an anthropological sense anyway, having only been first visited by the civilized world less than 1,000 years ago in 2164. Before that time, it was sealed away, warded by the ferocious sea beast Vomostrom. Vomostrom was, by all accounts, an enigma. He was, for want of a better term, a sea dragon. Fashioned by many as Vomostrom the Terrible, he ravaged the sea between Astilion and Oldenhir, sinking any ship that dared venture too far toward his unbidden charge, unerringly dragging any vessel that violated his borders to the crushing black depths along with its crew. Though many recountings of the beast differ, largely in this scholar's opinion, due to the propensity for sailors to spin greater yarns than have ever been heard elsewhere, some striking details of him do stem from factual and trustworthy accounts. Particularly of note was his exceptional intelligence. Vomostrom was said to have been able to speak, although this was exceedingly rare, and accounts exist of his speaking as many as 6 languages. And while those aforementioned trustworthy accounts are mum to his true proportions, old sailor stories from all over the coast posit that he was anywhere from 40 foot long end to end and 10 foot around to over 300 foot long and 70 foot around. Accounts of his head differ as well, with just as many declaring that he bore the head of a man as those who declare that he bore the head of a dragon or worm. The variations in the accounts have even led some to postulate that the horror was some sort of shapeshifter. In this humble archivist's opinion, though, I believe that these conjectures are victims of bad scholarship and of believing one too many tall tales. Frankly, I believe that the creature was merely a large one, likely toward the middle of the difference between the 2 estimates above, and bore the angular face of an aquatic creature. After all, that is what he was. The stories of him having the face of a man are nothing more than that, old salted drunks' tales. Other such embellishments, like the droll contentions that his voice could rupture the bodies of those aboard the ships he attacked, are similarly laughable. Regardless, what is left for serious scholarly discourse, and indeed the most oft-discussed aspect about Vomostrom, is his reason for protecting Astilion. It seems as though his service was wholly unbidden. With what we know now about this continent, namely that its previous settlers died out near to 10,000 years before the time of writing, it would seem that Vomostrom's desire for guardianship of the continent was wholly unrequited. In no recorded speech of his did he ever declare his true intentions or goals. Any belief that he was bidden by the so-called old folk to guard what remains of their settlement on Astilion is wholly ahistoric, and sourced entirely from those same old wives' tales that muddy the factual record on this subject so intently, and are discrediting to even the least self-respecting of many so-called scholars. Whatever his motivations, what is most important for this record is his slaying, which marked the end of thousands of years of isolation from Astilion. Much is written about this event, but little is proven. Among the more popular theorems for his slaying is that a lone magician by the name of Oakenhere, of unknown origin and features, miraculously slew the scourge of many generations in a conveniently unrecorded manner. However, the sheer vagueness with respect to this Oakenhere's identity means this story's academic value is suspect at best. Some particularly jaded scholars believe he simply passed away of natural causes or merely left, but they have yet to prove their case. With his disappearance, the Kakaran Empire was finally able to charter expeditions to the long-waiting continent, the first of which set off 2 months before the first landing on 7 Dober 2164. The Old Folk in the Autumn Plains, pre-landing, before 2164. For presumed millennia before its settlement, Astilion was wholly uninhabited by the likes of you or I. Instead, where our ilk was nowhere to be found, there were those who are now called the Old Folk. They are so named because, in defiance to all the histories of civilization elsewhere, it would seem that their civilization had existed since the dawn of time. The when of the rise of the Old Folk is ill-defined, with guesses running the gamut from 20,000 to even 90,000 years ago, and the newest dating of structures from their civilization is nearly 10,000 years ago. When the settlers from First Landing began the first migrations north on the continent, they were met with the bones of a once grand civilization. As they traveled deeper into the continent, they encountered massive roads and titanic bridges that had been abandoned for an eternity. Yet more fascinating were the tunnels. Built into the ground at odd angles, several being sheer vertical drops, certainly leading to some unfathomable depth within the bosom of the land itself. Their purpose is not presently understood, but that has not been for want of trying. Some particularly brave, or as I am so inclined to call them, foolhardy adventurers, have taken up the implicit challenge they present and have, at various times, tried to descend them. The deepest exploration recorded a 2,000-foot vertical drop, with the expedition only stopping because the delvers had run completely out of rope. These tunnels were dubbed the Chutes by the original settlers, a name that survives as the common parlance for them to this day. The truly fascinating and perhaps most striking structures, however, are those designed to bury the dead of these primordial people. Obsidian obelisks whose architecture appears to be a truer philosophical statement on the nature of the world than any guru, dreamer, or metaphysician could ever muster. In total defiance of the physical world's various laws and logics, these monoliths appear as pyramids balanced somehow upon their pyramidions, in utter opposition to the ways of gravity, a fact that is especially astounding given that they average 500 feet tall. Seeing one come into focus for the first time as my companions and I rode closer was a touch harrowing. In their presence, and especially when gazing upon them, something about the world feels incorrect, incoherent, incomprehensible. While I am normally a valorous and noble explorer when faced with such monuments and relics of the past, I was given pause after pause by these structures. Eventually, all of us fled away, back onto the trail, without even a word between one another. So unnatural is the feeling around these ghosts of ghosts that one could be found wholly unlike themselves, and so out of sorts that their simplest desire is for a time when they were a further 100 or so feet away. These places were named gardens by the original settlers. As before, this name survives as the shorthand for them, if for no other reason than no one wants to approach or think about them long enough to fashion a new name for them. Despite my very reasonable personal compunctions with the idea, there have been those mad enough to conduct expeditions into them, and to paint them as merely revelatory would be an understatement worthy of academic condemnation. They found remains. From these expeditions, it was learned that the old folk were positively gigantic. The largest skeleton found was measured at a towering 20 foot head to toe. Most often they were buried in a form of robe assumed to be ceremonial in nature, though some were buried in armor. The armor and the weapons found in the gardens as well were melted down and examined. This metal has since been dubbed Elder Bronze. The finest smiths and tradesmen the world over have attempted to replicate the metal by alloying and even magic, to no avail. Elder Bronze stands out for its sheer sturdiness, being nearly unfazed by the average toils of use, though it is poor for making edged weapons or tools as it loses an edge exceedingly quickly. Despite this, it is highly valued and coveted in equal parts for its durability and its rarity. Its evidently unreplicable nature leads some less restrained scholars than I to ponder unnatural means for procuring it. Their gargantuan size and their masterful craftsmanship are evident in what remains of their work. Huge 80-foot-tall stone cuboids and archways remain, even after all the time that has passed since the end of the old folks' civilization. Many of the common people who live around these ruins have dubbed them the Barons, a name more commonly associated with bandits, blackguards, and all sorts of unsavory figures and horrific beasts, as many of them have made their homes in such places. This leads to even more propensity for avoidance when it comes to these sorts of things. While the old folk toiled in the open fields of the autumn plains, there lived other people who were far too busy fighting themselves to notice. These people were dubbed the Crate. The Crate are 5 feet tall on average, with short, stubby legs, moderate-length arms, and tails nearly as long as they are tall. These traits serve an important purpose in their social structure, being the metric by which tribal leadership is determined. The tails of tribal chiefs are often longer than the length of their entire bodies and drag behind them as they walk. The Crate tribes are nomadic, roaming from place to place as their wars with other tribes go on. They migrate not to escape the perils of the changing seasons or to chase their prey as they move. Instead, they migrate solely to find and control other mountaintops that rival tribes control. This, coupled with their high rate of reproduction, has created a horrifying cycle of violence where these tribes kill each other over the same mountaintop they killed each other over years earlier. This gives rise to the horrifying idea that they have been this way for time immemorial. This means that these noble creatures have spent seemingly all of their existence, which, I should add, is confirmed to have begun a very, very, very long time ago, killing each other over nothing. This foul line of thought is far too infuriating for even this humble and level-headed scholar to continue and to entertain, so I shall not. Accounts of the Crate began early in the settlement of Astilion. One of the earliest records of them comes from Mr. L. Moss Winter. In his account, he claims that he was mapping the western side of Landing's Perch when he came upon some Crate scouts from an ice tribe, his words. He recalls that upon first encountering each other, there was a terse silence for a brief moment before one of the scouts made an attempt to communicate with him, which he reciprocated to the best of his abilities. This exchange was difficult, but eventually the scouts beckoned him back to their camp. He writes that they shared their food and fire with him and gave him a set of woolens that were rather small for him. As night began to set, he decided to sleep through it in this camp, somewhat reluctant despite their seeming amiability. However, some hours later, he awoke to the sounds of a struggle and found that the friendly Crate were battling members of another tribe. Panicked, he hid as best he could. After the fighting had passed, he wrote, "There is so much blood here that the snow everywhere around has turned to a red slush." Following the fighting, the opposing scouts spared Winter, and, while still adorned in the innards of those they had just slain, invited him to spend the rest of the night in their camp instead. Once there, he was offered a similar set of woolens by this new tribe. Here he writes that he spent the entire rest of the night lying awake pretending to sleep until daybreak, whereupon he hastily bid his hosts farewell. With this experience now behind him, he returned to the fledgling settlement of First Landing and recounted the events of the night. Stories of peaceful interactions with Crate have grown over the centuries since the First Landing. Despite their unending hatred for each other, the Crate are otherwise non-violent. Reports of their attacking the people of Astilion unprovoked are few and far between, and they are wholly outweighed by the number of reports of their amiability. However, the most macabre, given how common a sight it is, are the remains of dead Crate, slain in pointless battles with each other. The eastern woodland is otherwise composed of a hilly forest that spans the continent from the autumn plains to the Sudari Sea. Long, winding streams find their way through the forest's many picturesque scenes to be united with the sea. Dotting the landscape in the woodland are the ancient wards. The 20-foot-tall trees are constructed of a marble-like stone that glows with a brilliant metallic sheen in the night. This stone has been dubbed metallicite. The construction of these wards matches no other civilization on Astilion or elsewhere, leading some, myself included, to conclude that these wards were erected by an ancient civilization lost to time. Early myths of the woodland recall a tree supposedly called Heaven's Reach, which reportedly stretched 1,500 feet into the sky. This tree, it's said, was the home of a gargantuan bronze dragon by the name of Almog. These records state that once a year, the elves settling near the tree would offer her a tribute of food and riches, gold, jewels, etc., for which she allowed these elves to make a new home in the tree and offered her protection to them. This tale ends with the staggering assertion that an army of old folk came down from the Heartlands Mountains and slaughtered all the elves and wounded Almog, who cursed them with the last of her strength, causing their disappearance. This myth has never been corroborated. No evidence exists for Heaven's Reach or Almog, and, while there have been ruins excavated in the Heartland Mountains belonging to the old folk, the assertion that the old folk only disappeared following the landing of the elves on Astilion is completely ahistorical. I have also heard tell of many old settlers' tales about giant beasts and insects perambulatory trees that feast on the flesh of animals and people, and enormous predatory birds that were capable of scooping entire homes off the ground to be carried to who knows where. Now, the existence of these clearly fabricated stories is understandable. This temperate land, with its gentle slopes and fair weather, commands one's attention to its utter beauty, and it is to be expected that those who first stood here must have believed that something so serene must hide something supernatural. It is easy while walking through this land to find oneself lost in a daydream. Despite these inane near ramblings muddying the validity of just about everything written by the original settlers in this area, the hardships of settling here and foraging their way to the heart of Astilion must have been difficult to overstate. Heartland Dragons in the Northern Valleys, pre-landing, before 2164. The Northern Valleys region is the largest biome on Astilion, comprising the northern half of the continent. Colloquially and henceforth dubbed the Twin Valleys, this majestic land is composed primarily of temperate forests of cedar and fir that grow around the mountains. This land used to extend to the northern coast until the invasion of the North. However, what remains is a wondrous land of pure tranquility. The peacefulness of this land lends itself to unrivaled meditation. It is outright difficult not to find oneself feeling completely in sync with the world here, which was also noted by the early settlers of the area. This being the case, it is no wonder one can find so many temples dotting the landscape here. However, this all begins to change as winter starts to set in. As winter comes, the peace and tranquility are gone, replaced in equal measure by ferocity and distress. The snow here falls for yards at a time, with blizzards in the valley depositing up to 20 feet of it in particularly bad storms. These are notorious for creating a lack of game and stifling the growth of important plants used in medicine and as food. These factors led to exploration of the valleys being stalled for many months after the first landing in 2164. The valleys themselves are formed by a mountain range called the Heartland Mountains. Located in the center of the continent, these mountains act as a bulwark against the unsettled savagery of the plains and the barbarous cacophony that has engulfed the woodland as of late. The tallest mountain in the range is Twins Peak, which stands at nearly 28,000 feet. Only a mere handful of the bravest or most foolhardy mountaineers have ever attempted to summit it. Barring the more mundane dangers of such ascents, the Heartland Mountains pose a particularly perilous challenge to those who do attempt the climb. The entire range is infested with dragons. The most common type of dragon spotted in the range is the white chromatic dragon, though other species exist here as well. Beyond the extreme hazard standard for all dragons, though, is an odd behavioral divergence in Astilion's white dragon population seen nowhere else in the world. They hunt in packs of 2 or 3 and brood together on the mountaintops. This previously unheard of sociability among their kind has created a stark reality of coordinated attacks with very few, if any, survivors, both in the mountains themselves and in the immediate vicinity of them. Some particularly inane individuals have embarked upon expeditions up the mountains. Many hope to find caves inhabited by these more socially inclined dragons in the hope of ransacking eggs. There are many tales told of fools hoping to tame or even ride the dragons raised from these eggs. Though such absurd goals that would not be out of place in a children's story are frequently presented in quite lofty and fanciful ways, none have ever succeeded, and it is almost certain that none will ever succeed. Despite the obvious guarantee of failure, it is also guaranteed that fools will continue to pursue such inane goals to their deaths until there are no more fools, thus, until the end of time. On the rarest of occasions, other chromatic dragon species have been spotted. However, only one account of repute has ever posited the sighting of a red dragon, that being the Burning, which occurred in Koman nearly 20 years prior to my writing this. In the evening, as the merriment of a festival being held that day was in full form, and as the setting sun was gleaming its final rays, a looming shadow was spotted far above the city. As if it were a meteor gleaming down from the heavens, it descended from on high upon the streets of Koman, shrouded in its own flaming breath. Before anyone could realize what was happening, it had already struck. Its fury was unleashed as it scorched a crowded street with festival-goers. In but a moment, the whimsy of the night had been replaced by terror and mayhem that gripped the whole city. It proceeded to rampage through the streets, immolating everything in its path. By the time it had retreated, over 100 were dead and many more were dying. A great many buildings were destroyed and far more were greatly damaged. This dragon has not been seen since, but it has not been quickly forgotten. But this is not the only unique hazard posed by the things living in the valleys. There are other forms of life that hinder the exquisite peace of the north. The vagabond people of the orcish kind have dared lay claim to a secluded glen in the northern section of the Heartland mountain range. From their new home, they foul the land with their presence and prey upon the passing caravans to sustain themselves on the flesh of travelers. Of all the twin gods' graces and powers, why they continue to allow this detritus to pervade the majestic north is a mystery to all, most of all to me. They bring their animalistic nature to bear on all who travel the roads of the Western Valley undefended. Overall, the Eastern Valley is far and away the most peaceful and contemplative place on Astilion, and is by several orders of magnitude the safest. The mighty Zephyr Guard of the glorious Kakaran Empire keep constant vigil in the valley, solemnly protecting the land and its people. Having purchased my own modest abode in Kokana, it is here that I spend the vast majority of my time, since the other areas of Astilion have become home to far more filth than last I left them. High Marsh and its volatile history, pre-landing, before 2164. Nowhere else on Astilion is quite as enigmatic, mysterious, or magically warped as the High Marsh. Not having been fully explored at the time of this writing, High Marsh is a strange and seemingly incorrect place. Explorations here are hampered by its sheer elevation, with the lowest point sitting at approximately 5,000 feet above sea level, meaning that to even begin mapping and or exploring it, one must be a skilled and experienced mountaineer indeed. Even those adept at this, however, are in for an uphill battle, both literally and metaphorically, as in many areas the rock faces are sheer and slicked with mud and groundwater. For the first 2 centuries of its colonization, Astilion settlers left High Marsh untouched, as they hadn't the slightest clue what the sheer cliff face at the northern valley's western end was. When the first climbers braved the perilous ascent, they were astounded not only by the presence of a damp, warm swamp atop what was otherwise a standard cold mountain, but also by its sheer size. When sailors mapped the western coastline of Astilion, they were met with a similarly muddy and wet 5,000-foot sheer cliff face. When the first dedicated band of explorers set out in 2389 with the express goal of mapping the area, they were shocked to find large sections of the earth here simply floating above the ground, held aloft by seemingly nothing at all. They concluded that some greater magical force must be at play in the area. The whole ecology and ecosystem of the region were similarly warped by great, seemingly magical means. The creatures of this region, most of whom were also endemic to much of the rest of Astilion, bore harsh and exaggerated features and odd colorations and patterns compared to previously observed counterparts elsewhere. Some researchers believe these effects, as well as the generally heightened magical charge in the region, are the result of a spillage of primal magic from a sort of arcane schism that took place in the High Marsh region long ago. This spillage manifests in the affected flora, which are, on average, twice as large as usual, fauna and terrain of the marsh, as well as a form of severe magical disease, resembling mundane cancers that develop from long stays in the swamp itself. The flora here seem to suffer from their advanced growth. Many plants that would function well at a normal growth level are left unable to support themselves under the extreme stress of their own weight. Consequently, many bear wilted edges on their leaves, indicating an inability for the plants to adequately supply themselves with nutrients and water. As well, some plants have been mutated by this extreme exposure, leading to many new species and genetic offshoots of existing ones. Several carnivorous plants have been reported, and some accounts even tell of other unique dangers that none have lived to tell the tale of, though if this were the case, one would be forgiven in wondering just how these stories came about. The fauna bears similar mutations to those found in the flora. Most creatures endemic to this place regularly grow to double their expected size, which poses a particular challenge to anyone exploring here. These creatures are also beset by odd growths and exhibit strange, seemingly irrational behavior, even for creatures of their mental caliber. Some species, which are normally completely solitary barring mating, are here found in large communal nests entirely counter to their previously observed and expected nature. The growths observed on specimens here were found to be manifestations of the same cancer-like growths found to develop on and in explorers of the region. Early accounts from the first explorers of the area detail an incident where half of an entire company was wiped out by a 40-foot-long monstrous creature resembling a deformed alligator. I'd have scoffed at such stories had I not been invited to a private showing of the beast's skeleton 30 years ago. The terrain of High Marsh is primarily a basin, bordered on all sides by hills with the dip between them being the majority of the swamp itself. The previously noted chunks of earth held aloft revolve around the center of the basin in an elliptical pattern, casting large shadows as they loom over various parts of the swamp during the day. Some explorers claim that the most terrifying beasts only emerge when in these shadows. However, this is unlikely, as it is improbable that a sporadic schedule of waking, sleeping, feeding, and hunting is part of any successful survival strategy, and a creature following one would surely fail to sustain itself. These, thus, seem to be nothing more than stories aiming to further the fantastical nature of the High Marsh for respect or prestige. Stories have also been told of a subspecies of crate inhabiting the marsh, dubbed the Mambra tribes. These Mambra are larger than other kraits, standing as tall if not taller than an average-sized man, and are highly aggressive. It is reported that these krait are a pale white color with sickly purple lesions, sores, and growths marring their bodies. All attempts at peaceful contact have failed. Scholars posit that this is the result of the arcane sickness that pervades the whole marsh, a thought with which I concur. The end result appears to be a krait even more violently animalistic than its southeastern cousins. To describe High Marsh as anything short of incorrect would be gross academic misconduct. The political structure of the Autumn Plains, current day, 3019. The Autumn Plains are colloquially known as the Beast Lands by people in Astilion today. Much of the region is uninhabited by civilized society. Instead, a variety of beast folk are likely to be encountered. Tribes of minotaurs wander aimlessly across the plains, silverbacks live perched atop their hilltop monasteries, and a village of horrifying shapeshifters conspire from the relative safety hidden among monsters. All manner of horrors make their claim on the Autumn Plains, using the ruins of the barrens and chutes as their nests. In the farthest east reaches of the plains, the Zygon Empire has erected a large palisade. This barrier not only mars the beauty of the landscape, but also indicates that, for all their bluster and self-aggrandizing conduct, they fear even the lowly, bestial vermin that infest the plains. It spans the whole border with the woodlands, stretching from the southern shore all the way to the Heartland Mountains. It was constructed with no apparent concern paid to the wildlife of the area, which has suffered considerably under the presence of this unnatural division. Alongside this symbol of their cowardice, they have also constructed a settlement that they've named the Breach, though calling it a settlement lends far too much credence to the pretension that the Breach is anything but a shoddily built, roughly hewn wooden fortress that looks to be more a symbol of unfettered barbarity and a distinct and abject lack of civilization than any shining example of the polite society of the Zygon Empire, though perhaps there is here more distinction than difference. It is in the Breach that the Zygon Empire collects all manner of tolls and levies on those hoping to cross into the plains. Presumably, this unflattering impost goes to fill the corpulent military governor's already overflowing cup. Or perhaps it goes to the Zygon military, who, while needing any and all help they can get, are certainly wasting it, as no amount of festooning or drilling can overcome the problem of incompetence. In any event, when my modest company sets out for the plains, we are more often given to going through the western valley, past Allfield and Worm Basin, and entering through the north. It is a place where we can be doubly sure that no unsightly brute will attempt to extort us. At least, there is no unsightly brute whose death will be mourned. The unbearable human problem notwithstanding, the plains are home to one particular race who would certainly be in prime position to be taught manners and, perhaps as well, a sense of propriety. The silverback people, bipedal humanoids who bear an uncanny resemblance to mountain gorillas found elsewhere, live in the hills. Averaging between 7 and 10 feet tall, having well-defined, strong musculature, and carrying themselves with the dignity and grace one is accustomed to finding in people of long lives, these people are perhaps the only social reprieve in the whole of Astilion for our kind. If nothing else, they are certainly the best conversation. In spite of their place in this world, they are respectful and amicable to us, and so we are to them in return. Living primarily in agrarian monasteries atop the many rolling hills found in the plains, they are rather mysterious. Their grand history is all but unknown to us. Their ancestors and the like have been thus far unwilling to share their stories and histories with outsiders. Some of my more unstudious and ill-reputed colleagues have speculated that perhaps what they hide is a connection to, or, gasp, shared history with, the old folk. I, of course, posit this to be nothing more than mere twaddle. At the very least, our relations with the Silverbacks are cordial. They are peaceful, agreeable, and proper people with whom it would take a particularly dim mind to find fault. In that vein, it is no wonder that the Zygon Empire has been at outright war with them for some time. It is not uncommon to find a detachment of Zygon foot soldiers clambering about on patrol, as though the twin gods themselves personally bequeathed the land and its duties to them, and only them. The distasteful Minotaur, however, is the polar opposite to the agreeable Silverback. Constantly at war between their many clans, these animals stalk the roads and pose a significant danger to any and all hoping to explore here. The cacophony of their thundering hooves, roars, and shouts can pierce the ears even from 500 paces away. One of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had was when one of the brutes made me the target of its wild charge. It was only through the valiance and skill of the adept guard granted to me by the Kokaran Empire that I was able to escape with my life. The foul creature's head adorns my mantle to this day, a constant reminder that propriety shall always and ineffably conquer barbarity. Barring the random pack of heinous beasts or the rare sight of a drake high above the ground, so long as you have elven steel and skill at your back, the Beastlands are a beautiful and invigorating place to study and explore. The Desiccated Eastern Woodland, present year, 3019. One of the most riling injustices that I've ever witnessed in my time on Astilion is not found in overreaching tariffs imposed by the viler of the two apes on the continent, or minotaurs without a sense of their inferior place in the natural order, but is instead found in the complete and utter violation of the Eastern Woodland by those whom I hesitate to dignify with the name, the Zygon Empire. Not content to simply putrefy the lands bordering the autumn plains with their eyesore wall, as I detailed in the previous section, they have taken it upon themselves to ravage the whole of the stolen land they now claim as their own. They have seen fit to raze countless beautiful marvels of elven architecture and stonework to the ground by destroying cities all around the woodland, and even worse, they have decided in their infinite wisdom to replace them with vile gray hollow bricks. Gone are the flowing subtlety and grandiosity of the great marble towers and finely hewn homes of the original elven settlements in Astilion. Miles of intricate handcrafted masonry demolished, on which the heinous human constructs a temple to his own lawlessness and stupidity. Hundreds of years of history, written in the structures and homes we built by the sweat of our brow, are erased in only a few short years. Instead, the human being would have his own style, his own architecture, his own structure, his own way of life, and his own order. Replacing our proud landmarks are mere bricks. Every building, for every purpose, was large and rectangular, a solid drab gray, and hollowed out for him to cower in. Though certainly unintentional, his choices are telling. He emphasizes harsh lines because any nuance is completely lost on him. He emphasizes dark, brooding colors because they remind him of himself. He sees the dark, barren void inside his skull. He emphasizes uniformity because any imagination or uniqueness is foreign to him. He emphasizes utilitarian design, for he will not live long enough to appreciate any form of artistry. He emphasizes a soulless, oppressive, menacing design, because he is soulless, oppressive, and a menace. But more than his insistence upon destroying every cultural landmark erected by us in our long lives is his destruction of the very landscape itself. The human creature has set itself upon eviscerating everything within its grasp. It has destroyed thousands of miles of forest. It has perverted the natural way. It slaughters the animals without care. Sometimes it is out of annoyance, vex, or frustration. Others do it out of a sick and perverse sense of joy. It derives a sense of superiority from its despoiling. The gullies, glens, and vales that it tears apart as it works the land for its settlements, it pays no heed to the plants and animals that have already inhabited the area, as it paid no heed to us who live there already. The rivers, streams, and creeks it pollutes with waste and filth. It overfishes and warps the lakes, ponds, and pools. It taints the ground with its very presence because it knows no other way, nor would it want to know any other way. It has no appreciation for the natural world. Instead, it has only greed and arrogance. The greed of believing it owns the world, as well as the arrogance of believing it could belong to anyone. It hopes to hold dominion over all it surveys, even if that means killing, destroying, despoiling, ravaging, marauding, and tainting anything and everything that exists. It has nothing of value to create, and so it renders all it controls worthless to cope. My time in the Zygon Empire-controlled Eastern Woodland was permeated by malice. They control the whole southern coast of the continent, which they leverage to their advantage by imposing extremely harsh levies, taxes, duties, and fees on all imports and exports. Their capital, Volgana, as they've taken to hedonistically calling it, is one of the gaudiest imaginable. In stark contrast to almost everywhere else I went, I found some level of emotion in the works of mankind here. I reviled it. In keeping with its intellectual inability, what I saw was crass beyond measure. Large statues of their profane heathen goddess, Volgan, litter the streets. Temples dedicated to it are adorned with otherwise precious metals and gemstones. Where their misplaced devotions take on a more secular flavor, they are no less revolting in their display. Statues of various war heroes and great humans similarly find themselves anywhere and everywhere they could fit. Most droll in an unpleasant way was the 50-foot-tall statue of Manus Marn, the so-called Elves' Bane. He is responsible for a great number of deaths, including those of children, a fact that, in reasonable society, he is infamous for. Emblematic of its society's outlook on us and our long lives. The human creature stigmatizes its superiors, which is why it glorifies heroes in whose stories it can find some fantasy of defying the order of the world. At least, that's what I'm left to believe. And this is only the beast's creation. The beasts themselves were all too eager to prove me incorrect. Their kind eyes looked at me with a suspicion whose source I have yet to see. Our kind in this place live as second-class citizens. It is no wonder so few remain here. Everywhere, the beast's malice was overpowering. I was constantly concerned for my safety, because I knew that if I was attacked, I would be left only praying for a quick death because no guard would come to my aid. I was maligned, spoken to improperly, and belittled with churlish name-calling. Some vendors refused to serve me, others attempted to gouge me. Through all of this, I was never directly threatened with violence, a fact whose incredulity only struck me as I was leaving. The animal revels in violence against us and nature, but it cannot bring itself to confront even a lone object of its hatred. The only reprieve I found in this waking nightmare was the farthest reaches of the forest. In the scant few areas where the animal's filth has not permeated or even by and large been introduced. Places it has yet to corrupt. It was here that my thoughts cleared. I could find peace that had nearly completely evaded me. I could feel a connection to the earth and nature, however damaged they may have been elsewhere. I could feel the forest's pain. It cried out at what had been done to it. I was overcome. I wept. I wept for the land. I wept for my people. The land that had been and was still being corrupted and destroyed. I wept for my people who had been slaughtered. I wept for each life taken before its prime by a snake who had no right to take what it did. But most of all, I wept at my weakness. I could not stop it. I could not stop what had happened. I could not stop what was happening. I cannot stop what will happen. I departed the eastern woodlands shortly thereafter and returned to my home in Kokana. I have not returned since. The Political Excellence of the Twin Valleys, current year, 3019. Despite the current sorry state of affairs in the eastern woodland, life in the civilized world goes on, if for no other reason than to spite the barbarians in the south. Because, mercifully, the humans were unable to take it away from us during the war. The 13 families lead our youngest branch of the Kokaran imperial tree with a grace, astuteness, and strength of will found nowhere else on Astilion, and nowhere else except in us of long lives. The families are the direct descendants of the original settler leaders and founders of Astilion. Their lineage is great, and for their brilliance of mind, strength of character, and loyalty to the throne, their superior bloodlines were chosen to rule. The capital of our empire's now diminished holding on Astilion is beautiful Kokana. It is where the families hold their councils, deliver their edicts, and welcome their visitors. The skyline is accentuated with colossal prismatic archways that channel one's focus onto the great marvel, the Twin Gods' Tower. The tower was the first structure that would be built on the ground where the city of Kokana now stands. It is composed primarily of white granite and looms at 250 feet, with its diameter at the base being 50 feet wide. A sign of the Twin Gods' support and presence carved into the tower itself are 2 gold-trimmed white granite arms, half the size of the tower, that twine around it in a beautiful dance. Our Eastern Valley is the center of academia, intellect, and spirituality on Astilion. Nowhere else will you find the safety or serenity that is found here. The Western Valley, by comparison, is a vicious land of corruption and debauchery. Still present is the beauty of its eastern counterpart, though lacking in appreciation. It is plagued by the festering pit from where it is chiefly ruled, the city of Allfield. An octagon containing all the sins of our world, and perhaps the sins of others, is ruled by Malthius Demarius, the self-described tyrant. And rest assured, despite the label being born of his twisted, self-aggrandizing ways, it is not a misnomer. Demarius rose to power nigh on 30 years ago when he and his army, the so-called Horned Devils, rode forth and slaughtered Branby the Patient, the previous Sultan of Allfield. He then named himself Sultan per barbaric customary law in the city. From their den of evil they enforce all manner of vile injustice upon the Western Valley. Tolls from travelers and tribute from citizens are demanded, and force is used to obtain what fear cannot. Though the Empire's concerns rightfully lie elsewhere, I have been insistent in my pleadings with the Council to deal with Demarius, and punish his transgressions against the fair people of the Empire to no avail. When traveling in the Western Valley, it is best to keep a cadre of well-armed and trained guards at your back. The invaders of the Cold North, beginning in 3012, concurrent to the present day. In the northernmost reaches of Astilion is a barren land that was once named Bosvilla. This land was once an extension of the Northern Valley, and this land was ruled by the 13 families until just recently. When I heard about the invasion to the frigid north, I was in my study at the Koman Academy. Alman Cross, my assistant at the time, who was a younger man, not even in his first century, and who was under the direct tutelage of Archivist Harker Fell, burst into my study, huffing and puffing from no doubt running up the stairs of my tower chamber, and told me that a disaster was happening north of here. An invading force had somehow created a portal into Bosvilla, spewing forth hordes of monstrous invaders with strange, vile magic that twists the bodies and even souls of anyone who comes in contact with it. I truly underestimated the effect of this magic and the potency of the hordes rushing into the brilliant north. I had decided to see it for myself, and, to that end, prepared magical transport for myself and Cross to the now lost city of Crow's Rest. The hubris that I held in my heart at that moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. Allman and I translocated to the grounds of Crow's Rest School of Magical Horticulture. Immediately we were beset by a horrid cacophony. The skies were an inky black, drowned in smoke and ash. The smell of brimstone underscored the fetid stench of rent flesh and shed blood. And all around us whirred a tempestuous storm of horrifying sounds, screams and foul incantations being the most immediate. Within just a moment, I had begun an incantation to remove us from this hellish place as quickly as we had come. Before I could complete it, however, Allman was taken. It all happened in but a scant few seconds, but a horrid appendage of some winged foul creature had snatched him from the circle. I watched, and saw the horror in his eyes as he was pulled away. He hadn't even fully processed what had just happened, and then he was gone. My incantation completed, and I was once again on the grounds of the Koman Academy, safely in Kokana. I have relived that moment many thousands of times, trying desperately to think of some solution that will never be to save that young man who is now gone. I had many dark years after that day. In that moment, however, I was immediately taken with action. I rushed with all the speed my legs could grant me to the council chambers, hoping to materialize all the sway I held as first archivist to hold a hearing. Nigh on 10 or so minutes later, the councillors were assembled, irked certainly to have been taken from their previous engagements. I stood before them, pleading with all the breath I could muster for action to be taken. Frantically, I begged for an army to be amassed to abate the horrors unending that I had just witnessed. The council sat, somewhat in disbelief, some certainly reveling in the arrogant indulgences of watching me, an accomplished scholar, being gripped by seeming insanity at some paltry story. They waited, opting instead to send some scouting men to assess the situation, obviously discounting the severity and urgency of these circumstances. While they sat and waited, I was off. Returning to my study, I began desperately trying to assemble some schematic or outline on some kind of barrier to stem the tide of horrors now amassing. Though I have always been quite an accomplished abjurer, possessing skill nearly unmatched, I do believe that what I put to paper in service of this goal was some of my finest work. It took but 4 weeks for the wretched creatures to overrun the northern periphery and begin their march towards the valley proper. In 4 weeks, the council had done little but realize how foolish their aloofness truly was, and in 4 weeks I had devised my greatest achievement yet. As the dire nature of the situation truly set in, the council did something truly unprecedented. They requested help from the Zygon Empire. But to my colleagues' surprise, and to mine as well, they agreed. I can only speculate as to why the Zygon Empire did as they did. For my interest, their barbaric politics are mind-numbing and disturbing. But were I to hazard a guess, I would say that whatever inept spies they had in the north gave accurate retellings of events which frightened them, causing them to temporarily align themselves with us for self-preservation. After unveiling my plan to the council and to the Zygon representatives there attending, I was given a company of the finest elven mages to create what is perhaps the greatest architectural feat in known history. The Zygon Empire, for their small part, also sent me some mages, mostly novices, whose bumbling incompetence often found itself hampering my progress more than helping it, but I digress. In what scant time was available, it was constructed. Engineers and mages from both empires worked hand in hand to create it. My Arcanus Murus. The Arcanus Murus is the largest structure ever built by civilized people. Spurred on by the daily fighting to keep the hordes back, construction lasted only 5 months. Engineers from half the world away were brought in. Techniques from all civilizations mingled and shared, creating a constant, perfect motion of building. The skill and dedication I saw from the head engineers to the lowly workers was an honor to have witnessed in my life, working all hours of the day and night, never stopping by way of multiple rotating workforces. As I shared my magnum opus with the most brilliant and trusted mages of the Academy, we set to work carving the greatest feat of magic into the wall. Every inch of that wall was carved by arcane means, and at such a rate that we had little time to even sleep. As new sections of the wall were built, we carved into them, working our minds to the breaking point. By the time we had finished, the wall was a monument to the towering brilliance of everything the elves stand for and create. The Arcanus Murus is a mind-twisting 30,000 feet tall, and 5,000 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2,000 feet toward the top. When the final rune was carved and the wall lit up and connected, everything fell into place with a deafening click. As if knocking over Titanus dominoes, the wall came to life. Not literally, of course, but the wall's arcane measures awoke with a loud hum that it sustains today. All magical forces targeted at the wall are nullified, and any creature that uses that mutated magic near the wall will erupt in a brilliant flash of force, bisecting any creature made of that cancerous magic. Closing account, current year, 3019. While writing this account, I found myself in an odd position. I have ventured through Astilion and encountered many strange sights and people, but I still have this feeling drawing me towards further adventure. At my age, the body starts its decline into its sunset years. My dear reader, I implore you to go forth and explore Astilion for yourself. Its natural beauties and mysteries will be there until someone finds them. Work like this takes more than one lifetime to complete after all. I have done my part in sharing what I've learned in my years, and I am hopeful later generations will discover the mysteries and drive back the invaders. I have faith in my dear readers on this continent and in the Kokaran Empire, and I have faith in you.